Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming. For anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Ethan Katz. I teach in the History Department, and I direct the Center for Jewish Studies, and it is my enormous pleasure and honor to welcome our speaker this afternoon, Renée Poznanski, who is Professor Emerita in the Department of Politics and Government at Gurion University of the Negev, a department that she founded and built. Sorry, I'm just avoiding wires back here. Renée is an excellent historian, so I always forget that she's technically trained in political science. She received her PhD in political science from Sciences Po in Paris. She's the author or editor of a number of path-breaking books, edited collections, and articles. So I'm going to just speak about a few of her, to my mind, most important works here. She's a leading expert, I would argue, the leading expert on Jews in France during World War II. Her first book is called Jews in France during World War II in the English version, which was published in 2001. The French version was published in 1994. The book was awarded the Jacob Buchman Prize, and this is, to me, was a field-changing book. This is a book that really opened the spectrum of Jewish life in France during World War II in a way that was unprecedented. It has a lot to teach about the persecution of Jews during World War II, but that was a subject that had been visited in significant ways before Renée's book. But what we learn from that book is about Jewish life in so many different contexts during the war: Jewish life in urban centers, Jewish life in rural places, differences and similarities between the occupied zone and the unoccupied zone, Jews in all manner of professional and associational settings, ways that Jews retained agency in really important ways that I think had been almost entirely overlooked by historians before then. And it really opened up, particularly in areas of Jewish cultural life during the war, ways that Jews resisted, in both armed ways and in more aspects of everyday life. So it was an extraordinarily rich book, had a tremendous impact on myself and many other scholars. Her second big tome book, this is what Renée does. She writes really big books, both in terms of intellectual heft and size. Her second big book in my field, Propagande et Persécution, which has just been translated, and she's going to talk about it here, so I'm not going to give away too much, don't worry. It's been translated very recently as Propaganda and Persecution, the French Resistance and the Jewish Question. Is also, in my view, an extraordinary book in terms of, like her first book, it rests upon a wealth of empirical research, and it investigates this question about the place of the Jewish question, the place of anti-Semitism, the place of concerns about Jews, or the lack of place of those things in the history of the French resistance during World War II. I'm not going to give away more than that. I am going to tell a little anecdote, which I think tells you a lot about Renée, which is there's a short section in that book, it's like 10 or 12 pages, on Algeria and the Crimea Decree and then the restoration of Jewish rights. And I told Renée that when I read that, and it connects a lot to research I'm working on, there were a lot of new things there that no one had written about before. And I said, this is a whole book, it's mostly on metropolitan France, and there's people who've written on this, and I learned a lot of things just from that 10 or 12 page section. And Renée said to me, well, of course, it's a new book, we should do something original, I think it was revealing about something really important about Renée's work, which is, she's published a whole slew of articles. I'm just going to mention a couple in a second. And every single article of Renée's that I've ever read made an original contribution that was important to the field. It didn't just synthesize or recycle something from one of her books or give us sort of a case study about something that we already knew. So two of her articles that were particularly influential for me, one of them is called Rescue of the Jews and the Resistance in France, which was published in French Politics, Culture, and Society in 2012. And that is a really I think, conceptually pioneering article because she really lays out how there's separate historiographies of rescue and resistance and how they often could be confused sort of colloquially, but there's reasons why they haven't been thought about in the same terms in terms of how those historiographies emerged and evolved, both connected to Jewish concerns and disconnected from Jewish concerns in the case of a lot of the historiography of the resistance. Another similarly path-breaking article is an earlier one in Jewish social studies called Reflections on Jewish Resistance and Jewish Résistants, the French word for resistors, in France, which also was really important for thinking about the fact that we hadn't really conceptualized what do we mean by Jewish resistance in France. Do we mean resistance movements that called themselves Jewish, or do we mean Jewish resistors who participated in other movements? So I personally think that one of the hallmarks of Renée's work is that she has this tremendous deep dive in the research and does this empirical work, and that she's provided really important conceptual clarity on big historiographical issues. I think it's rare that scholars can do both of those things really well. The first time I met Renée, she doesn't remember, which is good for me. I was a graduate student. I was in Beersheva briefly. I was excited to meet the great Renée Poznanski, and I was 20 minutes late for our meeting. And I was apologetic. She was polite, but I think a little surprised that I was 20 minutes late. When we met again years later, when I was on sabbatical in Israel and spent some time together, she assured me that she had forgotten about that meeting, which, as I say, I was like, whew, okay. I got to know Renée much better. She's a generous colleague and mentor to me in the field of World War II history and history of resistance, and I had the pleasure of being at her Fetchrift conference. So I'll share one not so secretive secret about Renée, which is that not only is she terrific historian, she also, as was celebrated at that conference, is a great fan of detective novels. Like, such a serious fan of detective novels that they had sessions on detective novels at her Fetchrift conference alongside all these sessions on history of resistance, fascism, France during World War II. I tell the story for amusement, but I think that along with everything else I've said, Renée is partly probably a fan of detective novels because she loves a good story, and she always tells a good story, and I'm sure that that's going to happen in just a moment now when she takes the stage. So it's a huge honor and pleasure for me to welcome Renée Poznanski to Berkeley.
Thank you, Ethan, and I hope I won't disappoint after all this, and I have to plug that in again. And it was a very generous... Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean
It's going to be the way it's going to be. It's fine. Thank you for these very generous words. And I'm very, very pleased and honored to be here. And welcome to everybody. So let me begin.
Could you put the microphone closer to you? Thank you.
Is it better now that way?
I hope so.
Does it work?
It works.
I'm short. What can I do? Okay. After a resounding defeat, France officially left the war, and a new government, retaining some sovereignty over part of the country and settled in the city of Vichy, put an end to the Republican regime and collaborated with the Nazi occupiers. As a result, the Jews were faced with a double persecution led by the German occupier as well as by the Vichy regime. Marginalization and exclusion led to internment before deportation to the east and extermination. A propaganda war soon began between, on the one hand, the new regime and the Nazi occupiers, and on the other hand, emerging resistance movements, both in metropolitan France and in London around General de Gaulle. A large array of clandestine publications and daily French-language BBC broadcasts spared no effort to gain French opinion to the idea of resistance, exposing Vichy's betrayal of all the key values that shaped France. Now, how did I get to focus on this propaganda war? I was preparing a book on the resistance of the Jews in France. The Jewish groups, meaning the Jewish underground organizations, published a rich corpus of clandestine publications, newspapers, and leaflets, most of them emanating from the communists. In order to understand in which propaganda context those Jewish newspapers were being published, I went through the underground press issued by the French resistance movements. This was an absolute requirement, in my opinion, as I aimed to remove the resistance of the Jews from what I call the historiographical ghetto in which it was confined by all published works, those that focused on the subject alone, as well as those that ignored it or devoted a chapter to it without any analytical link to the others. I felt that the current historiography enshrined the idea that there were two distinct histories, the history of the French resistance and that of the Jewish resistance, as if they had taken place in two different worlds. I would argue, by the way, that it is still the case. And there I encountered a surprise. As far as the persecution of the Jews was concerned, the propaganda material issued by the French movement and the Jewish clandestine press, published by the Jewish groups, didn't meet at all. The issue involved propaganda emanating from the resistance, so I turned also to the transcripts of the French language broadcast from London over the BBC. The persecution of the Jews there was approached in a slightly different way. As a result of these findings, what was supposed to be a chapter has become a thick book on the underground propaganda and the persecution of the Jews, with essentially four cornerstones: the French underground press, the Jewish underground press, the French broadcast from London, and French public opinion, the target of all these propaganda efforts, or to be more precise, its representation in the eyes of the resistance groups. The following examples of key themes developed by the war writing, which are not associated with how the press treated the persecution of the Jews, show the impact of public opinion on these illegal writings. 1. The editors knew that the French were very much preoccupied by the problems of their day-to-day provisioning. Therefore, there were many articles on how the German occupiers were plundering France. Second example, the majority of the French population were Catholics and quoted as such by the new regime. So, the newspapers highlighted heavily the Nazis' hatred for Catholicism and the mistreatment of the Catholic bishops in Germany and Poland. There were frequent reminders, even in non-Christian papers, that the Vatican rejected the Nazi ideology. There would be many other examples. In their campaign to win over public opinion, the newspapers relied on reports about its mood and course. Let me add that a huge amount of material about public opinion in France on each and every topic can be found in the archives. The idea then was, and consequently mine idea as well, to reconstruct the representation of the French public opinion that shaped the propaganda policy of the resistance movements on the persecution of the Jews. Obviously, any study of the French resistance attitude toward the Jews during this period must also take account of the movement's actual practice. There is no doubt that many French Jews were involved in the resistance, held high-ranking positions in it, and were treated as full equals. Here, I'm interested in the underlying ideology, or rather, l'imaginaire culturel et social, in those thousands of ties that linked the resistance activist, a minority, with French society at large, in the zeitgeist that transcended political choices. The most striking feature when reading the reference to the Jews in the underground press is their uniformity on this topic. We could expect a rather disparate collection of publications. Communists, socialists, Christian groups responded to different ideology. Furthermore, some movements, while opposed to collaboration with the Germans, remained loyal to Pétain personally and even to some aspects of his policy until the spring of 42, whereas others were fundamentally and absolutely opposed to Vichy from the beginning. And yet, they turn out to be fairly uniform. With regard to chronology and themes, the subject of the persecution of the Jews is read the same weeks. It disappears again from the underground papers with almost perfect synchrony. The persecution is condemned in the same language, using the same arguments. The same topics are overlooked, etc., etc., etc. Until the summer of 42, discretion was the order of the day in most underground publications, as well as in the broadcast from London, with a few exceptions, the most impressive one being Témoignages chrétiens, which proposed a thorough analysis of anti-Semitism, its roots in centrality in Nazi ideology, and its implementation in France. L'Université Libre, the clandestine organ of the communist students, is one of the very few periodicals that included the battle against racism and anti-Semitism in its struggle against Nazism. But for the rest of the underground press, which was then in a more or less advanced stage of gestation, the subject didn't seem to exist. If it did, it didn't last long and was integrated into the rhetoric of class consciousness as in the L'Humanité, according to which only the poor Jews were being persecuted. In the other illegal publications, discrete reference here and there focus on 2 points, and only those 2 points when evoking the plight of the Jews. One, German racist propaganda is ridiculous, and it gets on the nerves of the French people, wrote Pantagruel in October of 41. The alleged Jewish conspiracy advanced by Hitler and by the Vichy government in the pay of the Nazis is an Hitlerian fable, franc-tireur. Racism is a disgrace. Liberté had a paragraph on the death of Henri Bergson and underlined that the great French philosopher was a Jew whom Vichy law would have barred from even entering university. And that's it. This pretty much sums up the list. Nothing on the new laws that had transformed the Jews into pariahs in the country that was the first in Europe to emancipate the Jews living on its soil. The second point concerns the identity of the writers in the press or the broadcasters from London. They were French, they were not Jews, their action had nothing to do with Jewish interests. When Paul Boniface introduced the panel on the Revue de la Petite Académie on the BBC, he said the following: "We are pure-blooded Frenchmen, and not a gang of resident aliens, fanatics, and corrupt individuals." To corroborate this, he went down the list of its members: a woman from northern France with blonde hair, a woman originally from the Pyrenees, an officer with blue eyes, a Breton, a Picard, an Alsatian, a Basque, and 2 Parisians. This is one example, but the statement that the broadcasters or the activists in the resistance were not Jews was repeated time and again. This discretion was not the result of forgetfulness, but of deliberate choice. Let us judge by the following example. In July of 41, Libération North disclosed the contents of the Hitler-Darlan agreement, reproducing it point by point. One of those points stated the following, and I quote, "We retain the political regime of our choice, with a favorable impression of Germany for a cooperative monarchy, and undertake to practice a common anti-Jewish policy with Germany. But the journalist's comment on it bore down only on the collusion between Charles Maurras and the collaborators in Paris, reflected in the reference to a monarchy. There was not a single word of comment about the planned common anti-Jewish policy. A first change occurred in May 1942 when Libération North denounced vile anti-Semitism, still alluding to the problems of aliens, of Jews, of foreign Jews. This general discretion, this silence during the first 2 years of the occupation has not gone unnoticed among the Jews. During that same spring of 1942, even before the massive roundups of the summer, there were various appeals to French public opinion originating in diverse Jewish circles. Henri Herz, a French Jewish writer, and Mark Yarblum, a Zionist socialist who was then head of the largest organization of immigrant Jews, decided to address public opinion. 5,000 copies of a leaflet under the title of "Silence is an Accomplice of the Crime" were printed on green paper. It became known as Le Document Vert, the green document, and widely distributed. Le Document Vert aimed at making the French population aware of the various facets of the anti-Jewish persecution, and I'm quoting, "More than 200 laws, decrees, rulings, and bureaucratic memoranda have been issued against the Jews since 1940, seeking by an implacable progression to uproot them from France, to deprive them from the ability to make a living, to deny them the very right to love their country." The French responsibility was denounced in this text in no uncertain terms. No concession was made to the fundamental values of the new regime, and it spoke in a single voice for all Jews, both native and immigrants. But the main thrust of the Document Vert was above all stirring the public to break its silence, to take a stand and to protest. And I quote again, "Have the Jews no possible recourse? Is no tribunal willing to hear their appeal?" It asked. Yes, the only sovereign, public opinion, you, because you can speak, you can cry out to the head of state, to the ministers, to the prefects, to the officials, to your relatives, to your friends, you, by the protest that you can always spread around you, by refusing to allow your pain at the external defeat to be supplemented by that of renouncing your conscience. This appeal to public opinion was not an isolated effort. There was a convergence of such appeals on the eve of the major roundups of the summer issued by diverse Jewish circles. An anonymous tract printed in Marseille by, and I quote, "a group of Jews, both those who have been French for centuries and recent immigrants who just fought in the war alongside the French, called on the French on March 13, 1942, in the following words. Your silence no longer satisfies us. Who will rise up against the injury being done to us? Is there anyone in the army, in the universities, in the arts and sciences, in the press, in any guild, anyone to make a gesture of disavowal, to refuse to go along with the injustice and fill the empty places it has created? Is it possible that nothing remains in France except for silence, in France from which proclamations that benefit all peoples have always emerged, in France, the country of the pamphleteers and the homeland of the rebellious, when history recounts the events we are living now, will it have no one to glorify, no name to cite? Is it true that authors and intellectuals, that French opinion has agreed to keep bowing down for so long? Is it true that no one says anything, no one writes anything, no one will say anything, that no one will write anything? No one dares, no one wants to answer himself No one. In the archives of the Jewish organization, we find various texts whose origins are not clear, all of them obeying the same imperative and slightly antedating the roundups of the summer of 1942. This kind of appeal to enlightened opinion seemed feasible because the relations between society and the authorities were undergoing a profound change. The Vichy regime no longer enjoyed the grace period of the immediate post-armistice period. A tendency to fiercely reject the occupier was manifested in the letters intercepted and read by the authorities. It was also in April-May of 1942 that the editors of the Cahiers du témoignage chrétien, the exception I was referring to previously, were working on the pamphlet Antisemites, 20,000 copies of which circulated in the Free Zone starting in June. Echoing the document vert, Father Chaillet also brought up the shame of silent complicity. In the next pamphlet devoted to the rights of human beings and Christians, the chronicle of the anti-Semitic deeds of the Southern Zone was reported under the heading Silence and Complicity. But the Cahiers constituted an exception. Before the German imposition of the Yellow Star in the occupied zone in June 1942, the Jewish fate was not an issue in the general underground press. This same discretion can be found in the reports drafted by Jean Moulin for de Gaulle on the situation in France. In his first report, you can't find any word about the persecution of the Jews. It was not before September 13, 1942, in a radiogram to London, that Jean Moulin broke its silence. The situation in the unoccupied zone is changing rapidly as a result of the increasingly pronounced oppressive measures being taken by Vichy. The arrest of foreign Jews and their handing over to the Germans, and even more so the disgraceful measures adopted with regards to Jewish children, of which the general public was initially unaware, has begun to stir the popular conscience. The position adopted in this respect by a number of leading French prelates, and especially the Archbishop of Toulouse, the Bishop of Montauban, and Cardinal Gerlier, were important in promoting this movement of disapproval. Numerous acts of solidarity attest to this mood. Everywhere, Catholic and Protestant organizations are engaged in protecting Jewish children. Note that the turnabout in Moulin's reporting was due to the change in the population's attitude toward anti-Semitic measure. And it is in this context, by referring to this change, that Moulin mentions them in his reports to London. This reverse in public opinion led also to the turnabout, a complete turnabout in the clandestine press when the Parisian Jews were recommended to wear a yellow star in June of 1942, and even more so after the massive roundups of the summer in both parts of France. And I quote, "The yellow star, the emblem of the persecuted, the swastika, the target for patriots' bullet. This is the response of French youth to the vile anti-Semitic campaign conducted by the Boche and the traitors." This is in L'Avant-Garde, the organ of the communist youth, in July of 1942. French youth were called on to demonstrate by all means their sympathy for those who wore the yellow star. Libération South denounced the Saint Bartholomew's Eve of July 16 in Paris, referring to the roundup during which more than 13,000 Jews, men, women, and children were arrested in Paris. The manhunt, which was extended into the Vichy-controlled zone, led some 6 weeks later to descriptions of the horror in an issue of the same newspaper, of which 70,000 copies were distributed. Why, wondered the writer? Because that's why Nazi Germany is like, he replied, adding, but how can France, even crushed, accept it? Expose the horrors of Paris, express your solidarity with all the victims, shelter. The condemnation was unanimous. Everywhere, even in the communist press, it was based to a great extent on pastoral letters that some clergymen has read out in their parishes, in which they condemned in no uncertain terms the assault on humanity represented by the mass arrest of the Jews, and these letters were frequently published in full. From the end of July of 1942, however, discretion regained the upper hand. While formerly the newspapers had covered the arrest and not the deportation of Jews, now deportation became the hot topic of the underground press. But, and it continued to play until the liberation, but this was the deportation of French forced laborers to Germany, not a word on the so-called racial deportations, as they would be called later. There was only very occasional mention of the Jews and their fate. One would scan it in vain for reports about the exterminations of Jews in Poland. The first issue of Témoignages chrétiens for 1943, again, was the only exception. It was devoted entirely to Poland. It referred to the systematic extermination of the Polish Jews, and then to the inexorable liquidation of the Catholic Church. The concentration camps where Poles, especially intellectuals and priests, were dying en masse. But in addition, there was one passage devoted to the ghettos in which the Jews of Poland and Germany have been assembled and to which all the Jews of all the occupied countries are now being sent. There is also a description of the mass shootings and gassings. These accounts of horror concluded with the following lines: in total, more than 700,000 Jews have been brutally murdered on Polish territory, and there can be no doubt concerning Hitler's plan to totally wipe out the Jews on the European continent. This issue of Témoignages chrétiens is extremely important because the only two resistance publications that mention briefly, en passant, the fate of the Jews in Poland based themselves on its information and referred explicitly to it. At the time, I must add, extremely detailed news about the massacres in Poland were being published regularly in the newspapers of the Jewish underground, communist underground, but none of the other clandestine publications saw fit to reprint them. Nor did anyone pick up the challenge hurled on March 43 in a tract published by the Mouvement National contre la Barbarie Raciste, an organization created and ruled by the Jewish communists and addressed to the Christians of France. And I'm quoting, "Since the occupation of our country, you have observed successive waves of persecution of the Jews. But what you have been allowed to see is nothing compared to what is taking place at the other end of Europe. Nothing compared to the monstrous series of crimes committed by the Nazis. Since the middle of July 42, Poland, the Baltic states, and the occupied regions of the Soviet Union have become a vast slaughterhouse in which blood flows like water. Based on necessarily imprecise data, at least 1 million Jews have been massacred there." Well, needless to say, actually it was much more than that. After a description of different ways of massacring Jews and a list of examples, places, and number of victims, the document continues. Despite the efforts of the criminals to keep all of these atrocities secret, everywhere the alarm is spreading and emotions are intensifying. Everywhere the churches are taking the initiative to protest against the executioners and to express sympathy for the victims. Christians of France, you ought to raise a loud protest of Christian conscience against the criminals and their accomplices. You must take the initiative for a major campaign to shake up public opinion. This call went unheard. It was probably not by chance that this tract addressed specifically to the Christians of France, circulated immediately after the publication of the aforementioned issue of Témoignages chrétiens. It seems likely that the authors of the Jewish underground press rushed into the tiniest open breach in their attempt to put an end to the silence that unfolded the extermination of the Jews. But the main underground newspapers, Combat, Libération, Franc-Tireur, L'Humanité, remained silent. The reasons for this discretion, practiced except for a short period in the summer and fall of 42, are certainly associated to a large extent with the propaganda campaign waged by the Germans and by the Vichy regime to the effect that the resistance was a tool of the Jews, that the Jews were its inspiration, in short, that the war against the Germans was a Jewish war. The archives of the Free French movement in London reveal that the numerous reports on conversations here and there concerning de Gaulle's Jewish entourage were always the subject of carefully filed notes. As Jean Escarrat, a law professor who joined de Gaulle in January 1941, wrote to René Pleven, who handled foreign affairs for the Free French, and I'm quoting, "One of the dominant elements in the propaganda conducted in France against the Free French force invokes the Jews' control of the de Gaulle's movement." Accused of waging war on behalf of the Jews and to their profit, the resistance movements found themselves on the defensive on this front. They had to demonstrate that they were genuine patriots and not in the pay of foreign elements. Combat, in its first issue of December 41, justified itself in the following terms. "We are aware in advance of how the imbeciles and traitors will reproach us. We will be accused of Gaullism, communism, Judaism, Anglophilia. We are fighting for the independence of France, and first we have secured our own. Our voice is authentically French." Again, we are French, we are French, we are French. "The day will come when we shall prove it." Thus, any reference to the Jews' fate required precautions. It was better to hide behind well-known and respected figures or adopted celebrities. Clandestine newspaper, and that's only one example, could reproduce without comment the letter sent by the Catholic author Paul Claudel to the chief rabbi at the end of December 41, in which he expressed his disgust, horror, and indignation in the face of the maltreatment of which our Jewish compatriots are the victims. The alternative angle of attack was on a work of propaganda with a manifestly German origin. The movie version of Yud Sus, an attack that actually targeted the detested occupier and aimed at anti-Semitism only indirectly. This can be judged from an article published in Liberté in July 41, when discretion was the order of the day. The German movie Yud Sus is being forced on us on all the screens of the free zone, in all the theaters where it is shown. Incidents proliferate. Why? Because it's German? No. We have no problem admitting that artistic productions, musical, dramatic, cinematic, reach us from Germany. Because we have a special fondness for the Jews? No. It's because we love and respect France. If France has a Jewish problem, we want it to be solved like all domestic problems, in the French manner. Not through hatred, which builds nothing, but through justice. This insidious film wants to make us forget the most dangerous enemies of our country and of Europe by focusing exclusively, not the exclusively, on the Jews, the resentment that defeat has planted in our hearts. True Frenchmen remember that in Germany they began with anti-Semitism only to continue with anti-clericalism and to wind up with anti-Christianity. Everything that the Nazis charged to the Jews' account, they have themselves done and continue to do 100 times over. Never forget them. Long live France, long live truth, long live liberty. As you can see, the thrust of the ideological assault is not a direct criticism of anti-Semitism, but a condemnation of the call to hatred. Anti-Semitism is presented as announcing anti-Christianity. And here again, the desire to assert genuine patriotism, even when one seems to be defending the Jews. Finally, we have here a theme that would recur when the period of discretion came to its provisional end, an allusion to the Jewish problem as a known phenomenon, but one that cannot be settled, it is hoped, in a French manner. But even during the period of protests, all the newspapers featured the same highlights and same themes. In this respect, the October 42 issue of Combat constitutes a representative example. The foreign Jews, the vanguard of French Jewry and of all the French people, are suffering the Nazi persecution and enduring a painful martyrdom. Their martyrdom and persecution make them more precious. All those who suffer at the end of the Germans, whether Jewish or not, whether communist or not, are our brothers. Their tormentors, German or French, will face a reckoning one day. As it appears here, the Jewish are the victims of the German Nazism, the enemy of my enemy, and they are depicted at the leading edge that announces assaults on the entire French nation. We have abundant examples in this vein. The same idea can be found everywhere. Here is Défense de la France. Those who are still so stupid as to rub their hands and say it affects the foreign Jews, not us, should make the slight effort to understand that after the foreign Jews will come the turn of the French Jews, and after the French Jews, that of the French themselves. So here you see that always the Jews are presented as being the first step in a policy that will go much further. Emphasis was placed on the fact that the Germans were the persecutors. That's very important as well. Thus, the Jews were victims of the enemies of France, as such they should be helped. In addition, the measures taken against the Jews were depicted as pure barbarism, Nazi bestiality, the especially cruel fate of children snatched away from their parents was evoked in all the leaflets and articles. Everybody was writing only about the children. We have something unprecedented. 2 years old snatched away from their mothers. We have seen near the Gare de Lyon a baby shaking with fever, carried off in his blanket to the concentration camp. Luna Park, Louis-le-Grand, garages just about everywhere were transformed into jail for these dangerous terrorists, Jews aged 2 to 15. This is in Libération North in middle July 42. The call was addressed to the people's moral conscience. The occupier and their accomplices were sullying the conscience of France. It was for moral reasons that they had to be opposed. The humanitarian aspect was highlighted and emphasis placed on human solidarity. This is the reason why the support of the religious authorities was considered so crucial and underscored by all resistance movements. The Christian umbrella was essential throughout the period. During the period of the roundups, all the underground newspapers reported verbatim the protest by some French bishops. And in those rare instances, when the fate of the Jews deported to the camps in Poland was mentioned, as I said, the articles noted their sources, témoignages chrétiens. Rather than offering an alternative political authority on this subject, resistance movements of all stripes preferred to rely on the spiritual authority of the church and use it to legitimize their criticism. Thus, we can understand the importance of the emergence of that spiritual authority that could serve as an alternative mooring and confer legitimacy to a clear denunciation of anti-Semitism. And finally, to avoid any confusion, making manifestly clear that the writer was aware of certain political sensibilities, most of the articles about French Jews were careful to distinguish them from the foreigners and frequently mentioned the aliens problem. Although its existence was not denied, its immediate relevance was negated. The moral condemnation did not imply a stand on the so-called Jewish problem. At base, all these precautions, that is what they were, found in all the newspapers to a greater or less extent, can be explained by simple hypothesis that the writers believed that the French were anti-Semitic, so that a ringing denunciation of all forms of anti-Semitism ran the risk of repelling them into the Vichy camp. The reports on public opinion received by the Free French Intelligence Service in London confirmed this impression, an impression that shaped the arguments advanced by each movement. And I'm quoting, "The consequences of the Allied victory must not be the plain and simple return of Jewish personnel returning as conquerors." This phrase, taken from a report on public opinion sent to London in February 1943, is the leitmotif of all the reports of the type. And believe me, I read them all. It's not 95%, it's not 98%, it's 100% of the reports which were being sent to London. And some even referred to the probable necessity of a numerous clauses after the war. Henri Renée, the head of the most important resistance movement, Combat, in a report drawn up for General de Gaulle on April 30, 1943, underlined the unanimity of opinion on one point. The Jews must be kept away from positions of influence, politics, press, radio. The general must not be the man who brings back the Jews. His conclusion was clear. Even though it's our duty to do away with any racial distinction, in practice, we must take account of the attitude of the population, which has effectively changed during the last 2 years. This was Renée's perception of the situation, and not just his. The French are or became anti-Semitic. There is a Jewish problem. Expressions of solidarity with those who are being persecuted by the German barbarians should not be mixed up with the disappearance of a stereotype that associated the Jews with everything that in the 30s caused harm to France. And I get to my conclusion. Indeed, I believe that the so-called Jewish problem, on which everybody seemed to agree before the war, produced a cognitive matrix that imposed its rules throughout the period. It modeled the definition of anti-Semitism. Only those who actually endorsed the Nazi horrors were considered to be anti-Semites. After you uttered the sacred preamble, "I'm not an anti-Semitic, I condemn the Nazi atrocities against the Jews," you could engage in any objective and perfectly legitimate debate about the problem the Jews posed from France. Long before the new regime of Vichy, born of the catastrophic defeat, muzzled the press, all of the most pressing subjects seemed to be related to a burning Jewish problem that was the order of the day. The torturing state of the Republican regime, the crisis of French society or culture, the international crisis leading to war, the foreigners who were knocking at the country's gates, the refugees who arrived by the thousands, the outsiders who were invading certain professions or cornering influential positions, the Jewish solidarity practiced at the expense of true French people, and so on. All the topics that invited, all those topics invited discussion of the Jews' share of responsibility for them. This attitude of the French elite and consequently of the population at large was not summed up by the sacrosanct dichotomy between those who were anti-Semitic and those who were not. It revolved around attitudes about one or another element of the alleged Jewish problem and ways to resolve it. There were not many exceptions. Marc Bloch, the historian, was one of them. This gloomy atmosphere spared no one in the wake of the French capitulation and made things easier for the Vichy authorities. It weakened public resistance to the main themes of the German-sponsored propaganda and encouraged acceptance of the explanations offered by the lawmakers of the new French state when they referred to a problem whose existence was acknowledged by all. It was perfectly legitimate to propose new solutions as part of the project for reconstruction that was the order of the day. On this front, too, the debate was open. Although the answers diverged, the tenet that laws were required to deal with the Jews' place in French society was rarely called into question. The horror of the Nazi anti-Semitic atrocities covered up the seriousness of the legislation adopted by the French government. The repulsiveness of the Nazi propaganda that demonized the Jews concealed the monstrous nature of some of the official commentaries that accompanied the enactment of anti-Semitic measures. Many in the circles that soon became involved in underground activity were not far from sharing all or part of the analysis that had led to the adoption of the numerus clausus for the Jews. This was the case in London, as well as on both sides of the line of demarcation that now split France into two separate zones. In these conditions, how could one speak out clearly? This reticence applied especially to propaganda material where everything has to be stated in clear and forceful language that was incompatible with the nuances required for examination of the Jewish problem. Hence, it seemed preferable to simply avoid the issue. All the more so because the arguments highlighting the Jews' responsibility for the war or the defeat sank deep roots in the popular mind. For a large segment of the population, it was a Jewish war. That was taken for granted. The defeat has muzzled the Jews, but perhaps a British victory would carry the risk of restoring their hegemony by reinstating them in their rights. So defensive tactics were required, and the decision was made not to challenge public opinion on such a controversial, sensitive, and complex subject. That was the price to be paid for nurturing the vital cooperation between the resistance and the people. There was, although, a different voice that followed a different path. Témoignage chrétien did not play the consensus game. From the outset, the publication took an unconventional position and did not hesitate to assert a spiritual leadership and unambiguously denounce the anti-Semitic practices of the new French state as well as the Nazi ideology. Their editors did not view the persecution of the Jews as a marginal phenomenon. For them, it was the very heart of the Nazi project. It was the soul of France that was threatened. And any concession to the rhetoric of the Jewish problem played into the hand of its enemies. They remained alone on that path, but its very existence demonstrates that another option was possible. Allow me to grant the last words to the Jewish communist activists that throughout the occupation praised again and again the population's unfailing support for the Jews and advocated time and again the union between the French and Jewish resistance. Here what we can read in one of their newspapers in August of 1944. Time has come to get things straight concerning our relations with the country's general resistance movement and determine the modes of our participation in the resistance framework. In the struggle we waged during the 4 years of occupation, a bloody struggle that was little known to the general public, we often felt bitterly abandoned by the very people who were at the head of the resistance. We certainly appreciate to the highest degree the admirable outpouring of compassion that has been shown toward us in various segments of the French population, particularly among the Catholic and Protestant clergy, and which was frequently translated into effective help for our elderly and sick, for our women and children. We also know that the many Jewish activists who on an individual basis contributed to the fight in the ranks of the general resistance are treated by their non-Jewish companions on an equal footing and in a spirit of perfect camaraderie. However, we found ourselves as a community, alone before overwhelming forces, alone in leading the struggle for our lives, for our honor. Yet this struggle was directed against the common enemy, and as such should have been taken into consideration by all those who gave themselves the task of defeating France's oppressor. Despite the tremendous bloodletting in our ranks, we continued to remain isolated, on the margins of the great resistance movement, outside the general plan of the struggle for liberation. We request to put an end to this state of isolation and their recognition by the forces of the resistance of our activity as an integral part of the general struggle against the occupier and its acolytes. Such an understanding with the responsible bodies is necessary to bring our movement into the framework of the general struggle being waged in the country by all the liberating forces. This remained a wishful thinking. Thank you. I'm sorry about the purple background. It was supposed to be black.
Renée is happy to take questions. You just raise your hand.
Can I sit down now?
Yes, yes.
Old ladies here with
Merci bien pour votre excellente conférence. Just two questions. One is, can you tell us, just a historical question, can you tell us what attitude you saw in the resistance press to the Statut des Juifs, both in 1940 and 1941? I'm forgetting the other questions.
No, that's what I'm saying. Nothing about it. They just didn't talk. No. It began to be mentioned. It was mentioned briefly in July of 42, August 42, after the massive roundups, and with the focus on the topics I was referring to. But no, nothing about the anti-Jewish laws, nothing about the anti-Semitic policy. The two things which concerned the Jews, which appeared in the press, were, one, the German propaganda is horrible, and I mean it's absurd. And two, we are not Jews. That's the two things. And sometimes something like Bergson couldn't get to, Paul Claudel wrote, I mean, names which could help evoking indirectly the fate of the Jews. But that's it.
Wow.
Nothing.
So did they, sorry, I'll just end. Did they mention, in terms of German propaganda and Vichy, did they mention the repeal of the Marginalization law or no?
Nothing.
Not even that. Wow. Okay.
Nothing.
Other questions? Okay. Oh, okay.
May I ask a little bit more about the témoignage chrétien? And two questions, which is, essentially, what was the ideological source of their distinctiveness? There were many other Catholics and many other Catholic priests. So what ultimately was what was the wellspring of that exception? And secondly, my question mostly relates to the point you made about early 1943 and their pretty detailed report about what was happening in the Polish zone. How did they know? What were the means? What were the networks that they were part of that revealed that knowledge to them that they could therefore publish it with the knock-on effect that other people knew about it?
Well, témoignages chrétiens, they were Catholic and they were Protestant there. I think it's an extraordinary journal, actually, and an extraordinary movement. They actually helped rescue Jews as well. But they were, I mean, it's just for them. They really, I mean, when I read, I couldn't even believe my eyes myself. When I read this issue on anti-Semite, I mean, I would leave it the way it is now without changing one word about it. I mean, it was such a deep, it's such a deep understanding of what was going on the function anti-Semitism was playing in the Nazi ideology, on the way it was affecting France, on the stupidity of this Jewish problem, if I may. I mean, everything. It's an extraordinary issue. They just understood what Nazism is. And there was, in their opinion, it should be stated the way it was, not taking into account, and they took a spiritual leadership. That's what I'm saying. I mean, the resistance didn't take leadership on this topic, and that annoys me in a way, because I mean the resistance movements were. Took leadership on other topics. They were, and they are the good guys. They are the good guys, and those good guys decided that what happened to the Jews was not important enough to take leadership on that topic. They renounced it in order to. I mean, this is the hierarchy of values that were important to them. And this was what I think is very important. But that's interesting because if you look at that and the Jewish press, and that's exactly what I'm trying to show, that you can't look at the Jewish press without looking at the non-Jewish press and see how where the encounters are not. You know, from London, I'm a little bit going further, but anyhow, in London, they wanted to. It was slightly different. I couldn't talk about everything. And they wanted to show that the French population was against anti-Semitism. So what did they do? They took an issue of the Jewish communist press, which presented itself as a French press, and said, look, even there is a journal which has been created to fight anti-Semitism and which shows how the French population is against what is going on in France. But for that, they had to rely on a Jewish communist journal. So there was no other way to do it. So that's really interesting. Now, the second question was about knowledge. Well, they knew a lot. I mean, they didn't know exactly what happened. But they knew a lot. I mean, there was the Allied Declaration of December 42, which said clearly that an extermination project was going on against the Jews. There was the Polish, the BBC the broadcast referred to what was going on, referred when Karski revealed what he revealed. It was broadcasted on the BBC. There was a service propaganda, a service special department inside the Free French, which was gathering information about every topic and sending it to the resistance movement for propaganda purposes. And there, in each, every month, there was a big package of documents which were being sent to France. In each package, there was something about what happened to the Jews in this country, in that country, etc. There was even a report drafted specially by this department about the extermination of the Jews. And this was sent to all the resistance movements for propaganda purposes. Nobody used it. So they didn't know the numbers. Even the communists were wrong about the numbers. It was there were many more casualties than what they say, many more murders than what they said or what they thought. But they knew, and the Jewish communist press was full of details, a lot of details. So yes, knowledge was there.
So I have questions, many questions, but I'll try to keep it to two for the moment. This is a wonderful lecture, thank you. So my first question is to turn to Algeria for a moment, because it presents, in my mind, a little bit of a puzzle, which is that in the months of spring of 43, when de Gaulle and Gurion are struggling for control of the resistance, and the struggle is in significant part taking place in Algeria, as you know, there's a moment where de Gaulle comes out for the repeal of the Crémieux Decree as what is seen as a public relations move on his part to gain support, right? So this seems to be counterintuitive with everything that you've told us. I am confident that you have an explanation, even before you just looked at me and told me that you do. So I'm really interested to hear it from my own research, and just because it presents a bit of a historical puzzle. The second question is a follow-up to what you said about témoignage chrétien. And so you mentioned, in passing, that it was both a Catholic and a Protestant publication. You know the Christian wartime press better than me, so I don't know how common that is. But I guess my question, in terms of trying to understand why témoignage chrétien is so exceptional, is, do you think it has anything to do with the Protestant elements there? You know Patrick Cabanel's work, where he makes arguments about Protestant religious affinities. We also have our wonderful colleague Robert Braun, who I know wanted to be here, who has written a pretty fascinating study showing that in majority Catholic areas, he studies the Netherlands, but he's done wider work for all of Europe, and it's pretty amazing how widespread the trends are. But in majority Catholic areas, Protestants were much more likely to protect Jews, and vice versa, by the way. But we're talking about France, which is, of course, overwhelmingly Catholic. So I just wondered whether or not you think that that's an essential piece of the interest that témoignage chrétien takes in this question.
Okay, de Gaulle. De Gaulle and Algeria and all the rest, actually. De Gaulle, well, if he tried to gain support in the population, actually he tried to gain support in the US population, based on this stereotype that the Jews influence American policy. And if you look at what he said during the war, I mean, the only declaration he had about Jews will get back to their rights was to the American Jewish Congress, etc. Nothing to the French. And de Gaulle had one of his speeches Well, I didn't hear it, so I can't tell you how long, if it was 5 or 10 minutes, but I can tell you I read it. It's many pages where you have all the details of all the people who suffer in France because of the occupation. You have all the possible categories: women, children, peasants, workers, everybody, not the Jews. He didn't pronounce the term Jew during all this time, and yet he was really surrounded by many Jews, and he was not, and even when somebody came to him and said, well, I'm Jew, it might be best maybe to be more discreet, he said, you are French. That's what is important for me. So he was not an anti-Semite, but it was not a category. Jews just simply didn't exist. And now, as far as the Décret Crémieux, well, as you know even better than I do, it was very discreetly reinstated by saying that its cancellation couldn't be implemented because there were no decrees to say how it should be implemented. And everything was very discreet. And actually, this was what happened in France after the war as well. Jews were reinstated in their rights, but discreetly. Always discreetly and indirectly. Not showing that you were, doing something in favor of the Jews. That was the main motto. Protestant, there was a difference between the two, obviously. A very big difference. And yes, obviously in the Protestant regions, Jews were protected because the difference was that, there were fewer Catholics, but in a way, the Protestants were all of them, the entire hierarchy protecting Jews. The Catholics were courted by the regime, and the hierarchy, had trouble getting convinced by others, by le Révérend Père Chaillet, for instance, that the Jews should act in favor of the Jews. That's a big difference, I think, between the two. But I have a special fondness for Saliège, because the difference between Saliège and all the others, actually, he was the first to do that. Before the Marc Beugner, the Protestant, he didn't send a letter to Pétain or to Laval or to... He prepared a letter which was being read in the parishes directly to the people coming to the churches. That's completely different. It's not talking to the authorities and trying to convince them. It's making public the fact that he disapproved what was going on. So that is really something which I think is really remarkable.
Any other questions? Oh, Danny, you've got one more? Okay. Oh, let's let Bobby, because...
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry.
I'm not sure how long it takes to answer this, but the arrival of foreign Jews and other foreigners throughout the 30s from farther east, what effect did their presence have on the popular opinion? Was it just an excuse to voice something that was already there, or did it exacerbate it, or did it arrive with more sympathy? And then amongst the quasi-refugees who were arriving in the 30s, did the conflicts that they had at home, did they bring them with them? Or the Russians and the Poles, the non-Jewish Russians and Poles, continuing to have conflict with the Jews when they were still already in France?
the question of the foreigners coming to France, I mean, the Jews there were actually a minority there. Yes, they seemed to focus the public attention because of Hitler's anti-Semitism, and because the anti-Semitism going on in Poland and in Eastern Europe. But among the other foreigners, they were a minority. And this was one of the problems. I tried to list all of them, but I mean, the fact that Léon Blum was prime minister, so the Jews are taking hold of all the politics in France. Yes, everybody said, everybody. I mean, the extreme right was writing that most of the people, he was surrounded only by Jews, all his ministers. And the funny or strange or interesting thing is even the philo-Semites, the people who tried to say this anti-Semitism is not acceptable of the extreme right, began by saying, yes, but Blum shouldn't surround himself with so many Jewish ministers, which was not true. Or, yes, the newspapers shouldn't be all of them in the hand of Jews, which wasn't true. And the Consistoire Central, for instance, tried to give actual numbers, statistics, showing that it was completely nonsense. But nevertheless, I mean, even the philo-Semites who tried to come to the help of the Jews against the anti-Semitic propaganda were relying on those false fake news, we would say today, so really all of this is it was one of the problems. And actually, when you look at those anti-Semitic propaganda of the extreme right and of the others, even those who claim to be writing or talking only against the foreign Jews, actually you see that when you read between the lines and when you read carefully, you can see that actually it was against all the Jews, and not only the foreign Jews. It seemed easier to write against the foreign Jews. But they were really, what's extremely interesting is that before the war, during the 30s, I think that there were so many articles in the newspapers against the Jews, or discussing the space taken by the Jews here and there, and the Jewish problem, what should be done, etc., etc. And when the persecution began, that's it. The resistance newspapers, silence about it. It's just incredible. This contrast also is very interesting.
I think we're at the end of our time, and I want to let Renée rest after a wonderful lecture and Q&A. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you again to Renée.